One more time, guys.
1,
We
2,
only got your mouth.
3.
And me. Okay.
Alright. Tonight we'll be talking about child soldiers. I'm going to start off with an anecdote. Calvin Graham was an ammo runner who served on board the USS South Dakota during World War II. In the Battle of Guadalcanal, despite being struck by shrapnel, he continued to serve throughout the battle and was assisted soldiers getting Calvin Graham was an ammo runner who served on board the USS South Dakota during World War II. In the Battle of Guadalcanal, despite being struck by shrapnel, he continued to help throughout the battle and assisted soldiers getting them out of the water. For his actions, he was awarded a Bronze Star for Valor and a Purple Heart for his injuries. He was 12 years old at the time. Children have been caught in warfare throughout history, both as bystanders and as combatants themselves. But asymmetric warfare in the last 70 or so years have seen many more kids involved for their various uses by militant groups. Over the past few weeks, I've studied the history of child soldiers and the modern practices of them. And tonight, that's what we'll be talking about. The first two segments will be about what caused children to join up in warfare and things like that in the past, and how those... Oh, shoot. Forgive me. And how that's being, those same practices are being used today. Is there a way to make this stop? Because it's this. Set it. Okay. This is technical difficulties, folks. Slide change. Oh. Why is this like this? Okay. I shouldn't be laughing. Okay. In many cases, future soldiers began training at a young age. In ancient Rome, the voluntari, or the volunteers, could start as early as 16, train a year, and be off to war at the age of 17. In medieval Europe, nobles would send off their sons to go be educated underneath a knight as a page. Once they got old enough, to about 12 or 13, they became a squire. And a squire just was an apprentice knight. They rode in battle, they assisted their knight. Worldhistory.org, a reputable source, said, "The squire followed him in on another horse in case the knight's mount became incapacitated. If the knight were seriously injured, it was the squire who was responsible for him." While the squire wasn't expected to fight directly, he was like, he carried a sword, that sort of thing. But it was mainly to defend himself. He wasn't supposed to fight offensively, but he still had to be there, right next to the knight, no matter where they were. Especially because they're cavalry, they're charging into battle, through the enemy lines, surrounded by the enemy. And which would be a tall order for any 21, 22-year-old, any adult knight. But we're talking about kids as young as 13 or 14. So it's pretty tough. In more modern history, starting in about the 17th, 18th centuries, teenagers would go to schools to become officers. They would be known as cadets. In rare, but not rare but common, but on occasion and by necessity, cadets would be called by their militaries to serve for the military, whether it's defending land or bolstering the ranks in some way. For example, at the siege of Chapultepec Castle during the Mexican-American War, all the cadets that were being trained there were called to defend the walls from the American attackers. Trained soldiers weren't the only way that kids ended up in battle. In a lot of cases, children would join because there was no other real option for them. It was the easiest way, or not the easiest way, but the best choice for them. During the Age of Sail, there was a thing called a powder monkey. And while it sounds kind of funny, It was a child, male or female, who was hired to ship, or not to ship, but to transport shells, ammunition, gunpowder from cargo bays up to where the cannons were. Put them in the line of fire, but because they were small, they could move around easily on board ships and navigate easier. In England, they were promised an education, they were promised a job, and they were promised food. These sorts of things were really good for that classic Victorian era poor child, like you see in A Christmas Carol. They had nothing. So to them, even if it was putting them directly in the line of fire of the Spanish or the French cannons, it was a better alternative to starving to death in the streets. Calvin Graham, for example, was a modern iteration of a powder monkey. His job was to move ammunition back and forth from a anti-air battery on board the USS South Dakota. And he joined because his family, his mom and dad got divorced, and he flunked out of, I think it was middle school. So he really had nothing to look forward to, so he joined the Navy. And then this little guy here, his name is nearly unpronounceable, but it's Momcilo Gavric. He was a Serbian boy, and when he was 8 years old during World War I, his entire family were slaughtered by the Austro-Hungarian forces. So he had nowhere to go and wanted revenge, so he joined an artillery company. These are not uncommon figures in amongst child soldiers. These are pretty much the most common thing. And that moves on into the modern day. If you don't mind, I'll move this over a little more. In the last century, the use of child soldiers has become a lot more widespread and dramatic as decolonization and the Cold War created all these small little militant groups that were fighting amongst each other for who got to be king of, or president, or premier, or whatever word you want to use for it. The Human Rights Watch said where did I put it? Sorry about that. Since 2001, the participation of child soldiers has been reported in 21 ongoing conflicts in almost every region of the world. The Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia in places like Cambodia, Thailand, Colombia, Mexico. All of these places have groups within them that are hiring child soldiers, or if not hiring, they're kidnapping. And if they're not kidnapping, well, they're slaughtering an entire village and just taking all the kids that ran and hid. And there's some pretty good reasons for this from the perspective of a guy who's fighting for whatever he's fighting for. Children can be great cooks. They can be taught really easily. They're overpowered, so they're good slaves. But they can be cooks, porters who move things back and forth like a little butler. Spies, because, a kid just playing ball in the street, you wouldn't even think about him if he's checking how many men you've got in your safe house or how many police officers are on the street. Sex slaves for the men and the women. Mine sweepers, just run them out across the field. They'll trigger the explosives. Or the kind of human wave infantry that really leaves a mark on your enemy because no one actually wants to shoot a 13-year-old. In many cases, to prevent them from ever coming home, they're forced to commit atrocities against the people that they grew up with. They're forced to slaughter their neighbors. They're forced to pillage, rape, burn. Because if they do that, if their neighbors and their family and their village hates them, then there's no chance they're ever going to come home. There's no chance they'll ever recover or that they'll ever be saved. These aren't just combatants. They're children. Their lives have been stolen from them by people who probably, they don't care what they're fighting for most of the time. They're just looking to, they're either trying to survive or they're pretty much already dead men walking. they're I had a place I was going with this, but it's learning about this. It was originally just an interesting topic, but as I learned more and more about what these people go through, it was tough. I mean, this is happening right now. Right now, as I make this little speech video, some kid is being brainwashed or tortured or something like that on the other side of the world, or even just a few hundred miles south. And so I wanted to share that with you and with you behind the camera, in the hopes that if more of us know about it, and if we understand what they're going through, that maybe things can change for them in the future. Maybe more kids won't be indoctrinated. Maybe these kids can be rehabilitated. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Just the camera.
All right, now I gotta show everybody again. Still here.
Free.
What's the button for this?
The one next to the lens.
Oh yeah.